Hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, thank you to Fashi Zizek for co-hosting with us so much in our friend's GSP's absence, and thank you to Ryan Dawson for coming on last week and discussing some of the hot issues with us. But it's good to have you back, GSP, back from your debriefing. I know.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
But quite
Glad
the
to be
quite the
back.
news week, and you missed quite the time too. There was a lot of big stuff that happened in your absence for about the past, I don't know, 3 weeks.
Yeah, I kept abreast of some of it, but I was generally busy doing other things.
Getting drunk.
Getting drunk, deep state and drunk stuff. Yeah, it has been eventful. But no, I'm settled. I'm back. I've been back for about 5 days or so. So
Hmm.
yeah, looking forward.
So tell me, what are the plans to heck 2020 election? I want to
Mhm.
hear from somebody on the inside.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that we are going to have like a show possibly this weekend um, with Vile Varangian, who I met with in St. Petersburg, and maybe it'll be like a show that like has a certain amount of focus on Russia, but we'll still cover if there's any sort of hot geopolitical topics that pop up from now till then. So I'm in discussion with him, and I think I've messaged you guys as well. So hopefully, looking forward to that this weekend, possibly Saturday. That way, I can recap some of the things that I observed while there, and also what Varangian's ideas are about Russia and how it fits into not only the geopolitical stage at this moment, but also culturally how it is interfacing with the West. And
Hmm. That
so
is
yeah,
the question.
we'll
That
we'll
that
go over some of the things that we talked about. Sorry, Perseus, go ahead.
that is the question moving forward. I believe, like in terms of like what is the answer to the European question? What is the answer to the issues going on in the West? I think the answer to that question depends on the answer to the question of whether Russia is going to be the sort of champion of Europe, or is it going to be sort of this champion of Eurasia? And that is a fundamentally cultural issue that it
Yeah,
would be amazing to have people like uh, Varg to come on and explain this to us, because that is an amazing insight to be able to provide from within Russia, the cultural complexities of that. Because, I mean, Russia is essentially could become a global hegemon if it wanted to, in this situation that the U.S. is no longer able to maintain hegemony. And then at that point, the question becomes, what is the brain and heart of Russia and the world? And it'll be amazing to hear what Varg has to say.
Oh yeah,
mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
excited. But to get into this week's news, things are picking up in the Gulf again. So Saudi oil fields were struck. Now, I'll give you a little background on it. So, the U.S. has reportedly identified locations in Iran which drones and cruise missiles were launched against major Saudi oil facilities on Saturday. Now, senior U.S. officials told media outlets that the locations were in southern Iran at the northern end of the Gulf. Saudi air defenses did not stop the drones and were pointed southwards to prevent attacks from Yemen, they added. Iran denies involvement in the attacks, which disrupted global oil supplies. Now, Yemen's Iran-allied Houthi rebels have launched drone attacks that struck the Abqaiq oil processing plant, which is the world's largest. Now, they have launched attacks in Saudi Arabia before, but U.S. officials say on Sunday that they believe the drones and missiles did not originate from the southwest, instead were launched from the north or the northwest. Now, in a televised address, Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei dismissed talks at, quote, any level with the United States, saying that any dialogue could only happen if the U.S. takes back its words and repents after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. So, quite
So,
the.
what do you guys think?
Um,
What do you
I
think Trump's gonna do now?
I have to say, I pointed this out on Twitter a few days ago. but it seems a bit odd to me considering the fact I know they say the Saudi air defense were targeted at Yemen, making sure there were no strikes from there. But Syria, time and time again, with their outdated air defenses from the 60s and 70s, can repel several Israeli attacks. Not all of them successfully, but pretty good with what they're working with. But Saudis using last generation American weapons and who are supposedly afraid of Iranian aggression didn't have anything set up to repel any potential Iranian attack.
Yeah, it seems dodgy, right? They've got, I think, the previous generation Patriot missile system. Uh, I mean, my own guess is that these aren't coming from Iran. I don't see any proof. Uh, Showing where the explosions happened isn't proof. Uh, they could show proof, of course, if they wanted to, and it would prove that it was the Houthis. I believe one of the missiles was the cruise type. And let's not forget that the Houthis have been doing this for at least 2 years now. They've been attacking other areas of Saudi Arabia with their missiles. So, the capabilities in 2019 have exceeded uh, from those in 2017 and late 2016. But it has been going on. I mean, the media portrays it as if that's not what's happening.
Now, to further on
Yeah,
this, I wanted
and
to bring up the Trump
oh,
tweet
just
that
real quickly. So just yeah, yeah, just real quickly. I just wanted to add that the debate's been on whether Iran did it or not, but ultimately whether the Houthis shot it or Hashed in Iraq shot it. At the end of the day, it is technically Iran in this sense. Like people like the neocons, like Lindsey Graham or whoever who is calling these Iranian attacks, in this sense, like they are technically right. But was whether it was actually launched from Iran and necessitates an actual attack. That's a different issue because like GSP was saying that if they spot the location in Iraq, an attack on Iran wouldn't make sense. It would be like 9/11, even though the Saudis claimed that was their 9/11. It would be 9/11 all over again in the sense
What
that the
people on
country that
TV, that's what
attacks the
oil is to
U.S.
us. Our
Yeah,
9/11.
but it would be 9/11 in the sense that the country that attacks the U.S. is not the one that's actually going to get attacked by the U.S. You know, and so
Literally a gas station monarchy.
yeah, poor Iraq. Like anything that goes on in the world by the Saudi or anyone else, they just get the punishment for it. But but go ahead with the Trump tweets because the tweets were what was ridiculous. I mean, it was beyond like unpresidential, I believe. But please read the tweets.
now, just to give a little perspective, keep in mind John Bolton got fired less than a week ago, actually about a week ago at this point. And Trump was talking about how he disagreed with him and how we need to be less hawkish, less involved in the world, and focus more on ourselves. He comes out on Sunday evening with this tweet I read verbatim right now. Saudi Arabia's oil supply was attacked. There's reason to believe that we know the culprit. Are locked and loaded depending on verification, but are waiting to hear from the kingdom as to who they believe caused the attack and under what terms we would proceed. So, well, now the way most people
Yeah,
read
and
this, yeah, the way I read it is like, well, we're waiting for Saudi Arabia to tell us who to unload our payload on.
the worst part of the tweet was that it ended in a question mark. Like he's not even sure. Like what? Like maybe I don't know. Like it was the saddest show of force I think in U.S. history. To be honest, like one, it's after an attack that happened on Saudi. Like who cares? I mean, straight up, who cares? Whoever attacked Saudi, but then to decide U.S. foreign policy based on whatever Saudi decides, and you can't even say it strongly. You end it in a question mark.
He actually
I
has
thought it was
he
just
has an
Good point.
he has an exclamation point, but it might as well be a question mark at this point. Now, one thing I will point out is with the schizophrenia of Trump's policy, he comes out with this. Yet the next day, on Monday, he signs an executive order saying we can use our oil reserves in order to set off the rise in gas prices, showing where he wants to be like, okay, this doesn't affect us. We have our own oil, but also we're waiting on the kingdom's verification on who we attack.
Yeah, I mean, America has to play this delicate role where its price for oil can't go too high and it can't go too low, which isn't the case with Russia. Of course, if it goes high, it works for Russia very well. Um, I believe it's up to $71 now. I mean, there's already Western media saying Putin is going to get rich from this. He's going to buy off all his detractors after the last election because he lost several seats and so on. But um, I mean, I think it is. It is a threat. Like the fact that the Houthis can reach Saudi Arabia like this. Can Saudi Arabia afford another hit? That's the question. Um, can it afford another two hits in the next 6 months? Those are real possibilities, right? What kind of precedent is going to be set if Trump does nothing?
Well,
Um, I mean, the situation is serious. You know, uh, America has, let's say, a lot of obligations, not the least of which is spurred on by the fact that oil is bought and sold with American dollars, right? So are they going to retaliate against Iran? You know, some people are suggesting even more sanctions on Iran. It boggles the mind what more can be done. On the other hand, some are hawkish, but I don't believe that the American public is going to back a war in Iran. I simply don't see it.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is just the end of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, and it's really hard for people to sort of like accept that, in the sense that people like John Bolton, this was his main issue, was that he was trying to maintain this hegemony that requires so much brute force, so much cost that Trump isn't willing to commit to. And so Trump is in this really bad situation where he has to sort of decide, do I just give Iran everything they want, or do I go into all out war? There's really no in between. There's no middle ground for him. And he kind of put himself in this position by reneging on the JCPOA. He
now
never had to do.
Yes.
you actually made the joke that Trump's going to end up giving Iran more money than Obama ever did, and I'm inclined to agree because, okay, as we stated, it's one or the other. There's no gray area in this situation. One of the few times that holds true. He can either go to war right before an election and squander his chances among his base and moderates alike, or he can go back and he can apologize to the Iranians, saying, "Oh, look, let's turn over a new page. Let's reset our diplomatic relations. Let's shake hands and play nice." Which I think, believe it or not, especially with Bolton out, playing back into that, might actually happen.
Yeah, and I think the issue here too is that, a lot of people are trying to make this sound like this is some sort of false flag to give the US a pretext to war in with Iran. And this is actually not what's going on. Instead, what's going on is that Iran is seeing that they can push the US extremely far and they're not going to retaliate. I mean, every instance, whether it was first with seizing the boats to shooting down the drone to now, firing into Saudi, like every instance is Iran actually just essentially testing the waters to see how far they can go with this administration. And the reality is starting to show that, you know, Trump can't really do much, unless he's going to go with the full heavy hand, which is extremely unpopular domestically and internationally. And
And
so, go ahead.
to add on that, if it was a false flag, which I said it was a bit suspicious, maybe Saudi Arabia, granted, knowing their military, the way they function, I could actually ascribe that to incompetence. Just with some things you hear about, like the people who serve over there, like talking about cooperation with the Saudi military, they say they're some of the laziest people they've ever worked with. But that's aside the point. The point is, if Trump wanted pretext for war with Iran, he's had 2 years. He's had several opportunities to start both wars with Iran and Syria. Yet, even with people like Bolton people with like McMaster and Pompeo, he still resisted the call every time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and let's not forget next year's election year, and he's going to be campaigning the idea that he's going to. I mean, if he sets off this war, he had better do it right now, and it had better be resolved within months. Like it would have to be more effective than the first Gulf War in '91. That's how decisive it would have to be, and that war in itself was not decisive. It still needed another 8 years of constant bombing, and then finally another invasion, another occupation. Um, the truth is, unless Trump really doesn't want to get elected, I don't think he's going to start a war because it will be yet another policy of his um, that will weaken him in the debates. So far, the topics that are on the table right now, uh, arguably he could win. He could persuade uh, voters to go his way again. Uh, I think with the war and him scrapping the deal with Iran, which the Democrats had set up, which is, I think, really the one and only great thing that the Obama administration ever did. If he does that, especially with the public that is more or less tired of more war, um, it's over. He's going to destroy his base by doing that, and he's going to have a topic that they can hang on and criticize him. And I don't think he's going to have a counter argument that will help him win.
Yeah, it'd be a topic that actually wins over the moderate rather than, oh, he said something perceivably racist 15 years ago. It's something that people actually care about, that your person who's pretty apolitical might be like, okay, that's bad. Another thing I also wanted to point out is what we believe, at least on this program, prevented strikes on Iran the last time, Trump's last minute reversal, was the possibility of Iranian and Iranian proxy retaliation. And especially this case, if those missiles, if those drones were from Iran proper, not any proxies in Iraq or Yemen, we have to consider they can hit U.S. forces in the Gulf. They can hit U.S. forces in Iraq. We've seen with recent strikes on anti-Assad groups in Syria in previous months, they can hit targets in Syria, and they can most definitely hit targets in Afghanistan. And I think for that exact reason, military action by the U.S. will be prevented by that, I guess you call it, dead hand switch on Iran's part.
Right, and Iran is adopting a very similar strategy to what Russia has been adopting in Syria, and that is hit weak points without, with with some involvement, right? With Iran in this case, it's indirect involvement, but it's involvement. But fight asymmetrically, so you don't kill American soldiers, because then the pretext for war is set for retaliation. Absolutely, right? But you go after the weak areas, and you use the fear of America's obligation to escalation against it. So that, for the public is, well, we're not going to go to war, because of some stupid war that's been going on for 4 years in Yemen, and so on and so on. And, boohoo, Saudi Arabia, got some of its refineries blown up. Hey, wait a minute, didn't you press for Saudi Arabia to give the details of the 15 hijackers? Like, it's not. America has too many geopolitical obligations and political obligations, right? Not to mention cultural obligations, right? As still the leader of the world, and Iran is playing on that, right, by using Yemen as a proxy to attack weak, vulnerable, uh, you know, targets that are important to America. Ultimately, geopolitically, are important to America, but that would require an escalation that it cannot afford to do. So, like, the Russia, in a similar way, in a more direct way, has been doing the same thing in Syria. Russia's involvement of course, would force America to escalate, and that was something that America wasn't willing to do. It wasn't unanimously behind an invasion in Syria or an involvement higher than that of Libya. Uh, so um, this this tactic of forcing America to escalate when it knows it cannot, right? It seems to be working. You could even argue that the similar things happen in Georgia as well.
Yeah.
It's kind of daring them to escalate. Okay, you go ahead, you escalate it. Let's see, and this is deriving from the idea that America has spent so much of its energy fighting wars from after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 2000s that it it simply doesn't have the energy to keep doing that.
Now, the last thing I want to say on this before we get into the oil prices and the chaos with that is just to build on what you said. If you think of the American Empire as like a Jenga tower, like the kids' game, I believe that war with Iran, direct confrontation with Iranians, whether it is directly with Iran or engaging their forces in Iraq or Syria or wherever, is that one block we pull out that makes everything come tumbling down. That's my assessment of it, at least. Unless either of you have any more thoughts, we
Yeah.
can move on to the oil.
No, we can.
Nope,
I
I'm
can
good.
move on. Yeah.
So you want me to take the lead on the oil price as well?
Please.
Okay, I didn't figure you'd be eager for this one, but so oil prices soared 20% after the attacks, at one point reaching $71.95 a barrel. But they have since pared their gains, as it appears market disruption would not be as bad as feared. Now, today, on Tuesday, Saudi's energy minister said that he fully expected production to be fully back online at the end of the month, adding that half the production facility damaged had already been restored. Now, Brent crude, the international benchmark used by traders, was trading at about $64 at after the announcement. Now, the question is, which we got into a little bit, but I suppose we can bring up again, is was this a false flag? Why or why not? I will start out by saying I think it was probably an Iranian proxy, probably not a false flag, and could be chalked up to Saudi incompetence more than anything.
Hmm.
But yeah, just in terms of the oil prices, just I think the it will affect in terms of like the American taxpayer eventually. I mean, with Saudi being unable to produce as much as they were previously, they're calling for half of a halting of half of their production right now. That will affect the oil prices, and this is sort of leading to some of the news that came out today with France taking charge of in Instex and trying to make deals with France. I mean, excuse me, with Iran for this oil that the U.S. essentially has sanctioned itself out of negotiating for while Saudi can no longer produce. And so Trump may tout that, like, oh, we have our own oil. Even though the U.S. has oil, it's not in a position to sell it to its citizens. In fact, the U.S. government doesn't want to. Just like GSP sort of explained, the goal is to sort of keep oil at this price where it's neither too much or too cheap. And uh, you know, right now, if we were to operate on just the oil and gas that is produced in North America, of course it'd be a hell of a lot cheaper. But that's not how this empire works. I mean, this empire will, ship bananas from, South America because it's cheaper than to grow it from the local farmer. You know, so this is sort of the issue with empires that, when the U.S. system is based on, uh, like the dollar is really heavily tied to the value of gas, and gas depends on OPEC. The U.S. is going to be more concerned with the stability of OPEC than American society. So it is entirely possible that when gas prices will go up as these escalations increase if Trump doesn't make a deal. And as gas prices go up, it's not just your car. When gas goes up, things
Energy.
like food goes up. Yeah, food, energy, everything. And so, yeah, Trump. There is a chance where Trump could have his hand forced. by these little escalations.
not to make too much of a comparison, but you have to recall the initial incident behind the Yellow Vest protest around this time last year was the fact that Macron imposed a heavy gas tax that affected heating in the winter. Not that I'm saying that the American people at this point would go as far as the Yellow Vest, but I'm saying it could cause some discontent if something like that happens. Granted, it wouldn't be a tax in this case, but point being is gas prices rising or gas prices rising regardless of the reason.
Yeah, that was actually Ryan Dawson's point last week too, with interestingly as to why he thought Macron was taking charge in friendlier relations with Iran is because he's trying to get gas before the winter. It makes sense. It really does make sense.
Monsieur Rouhani, we need the gas.
Yeah, I mean, the it's often touted. You have all sorts of people touting, in America about we're the greatest oil exporter and so on and so on. And the truth is, there's no profit really if you have to sell it to your own citizens. Um, that's not the point of it. And of course, if it's your country that the entire world is obligated to use your dollar to buy and sell oil, it doesn't really make any sense. Not really. But yes, keeping oil going as a fluid substance that's the taps are always on and so on. Yeah, that's what counts, even more than the actual price, though both of them count. But myself, I don't know if this was, it could have been incompetence by Saudi Arabia. How they managed to do this, I don't know. I mean, anything is possible. I just tend to think that that the Houthis, the simplest answer is that it was the Houthis, and because they've already demonstrated that they're capable of this enormous reach. Why wouldn't they? And it's advantageous for Iran to use them that way because nobody wants to see American jets just obliterate Yemen. This is a war that even American elites and American media has kept it as a secret. Um, and they don't. They're Yemen so far hasn't killed any American soldiers. So um, I just for myself, I do think it was the Houthis, but
Sure,
probably my
sure.
second guess would be perhaps a mistake.
All right. All right, so let's move on to the Israeli elections because I have an update. So it is
Oh, okay.
apparently it is being called that Benny Gantz has defeated Benjamin Netanyahu
You're kidding,
for
right?
Israel's
Wow.
prime minister. Right now, it's essentially they're saying it's too close to call, but the exit polling is indicating Benny Gantz yeah,
So,
Benny Gantz. Is that his name?
yeah. So is it time to get the
Yeah,
Yeah,
is it
Gantz.
Benny
time to get
Wise. Benny Wise.
is it time to get the crabs ready?
No, because it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, but
So apparently 20 minutes ago, it was reported from your tweet that I guess Netanyahu isn't going out quietly. He is calling for Israel to have a Zionist government that is committed for Israel as a Jewish state. So here he's pissed because apparently this had the highest Arab voting turnout, and
Oh,
obviously,
wow.
what do you expect? They're a democracy. They're gonna have to own
the
it.
only democracy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you want it, you're gonna have it. So it turns out that the Arabs voted for Gantz, I guess, and that's what looks like it put Netanyahu over and his party over as well. Um, so we'll see. It's not for sure yet, but it looks like all signs are being pointed to that. But as for Netanyahu's statement that it is just no, it's just kind of ridiculous. That's how Israel has always been. I don't know what what he's calling for exactly.
I'm a bit surprised, and again, not that Not that Gantz will be much different. I imagine he'll be much less. I mean, of course, he'll try to still play it up to the U.S. and the West, but I don't think he'll be as insufferable as Netanyahu. At least we'll get a fresh face doing it.
I'm curious where all these negotiations that are taking place with Putin and Netanyahu. I wonder where this leaves, where it's going to go um, in the future. Of course, I think Putin endorsed Netanyahu for the election. It'll be interesting to watch. I'm also curious who Gantz is going to align himself, because like him or hate him, Netanyahu has made a very big effort to try to win over populist leaders like Orban, for instance, and try to align himself with European nationalism and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see where Gantz is going to go with that. There was a lot of heavy investment by Netanyahu towards those ends. To put into perspective, um, you know, I can't recall the last time Israel in the last 10 or 15 years has done something like this. Yes, taken advantage or played its cards right, based on whatever political movement is going on. But a right wing nationalist populist movement in Europe, you know, seems very unlikely. So I'm just curious about how things are going to develop with Gantz, and who knows even how long Gantz will be there.
Yeah, just a couple things on that. I see Gantz, just the little I know about him, he's probably going to try to appeal to the European and more like, oh, we're a liberal democracy rather than we're a Jewish state fighting against Islamic terrorism. He's probably going to go again with the former route and say like, look, we're just like you, we're just like Europe, we want to be like you. And that actually goes back to one of the quips that was made by some Israeli official a few months ago. It's like, maybe we can take the UK place in the European Union. Granted, that was an offhand remark, but in regards to the Netanyahu Putin talk, so Netanyahu, of course, went around to foreign countries trying to beg for support from foreign leaders before every election, like he does. And the reports say Putin kept him waiting for 3 hours before actually meeting with him. Now, Putin's known to do this. He's kept even the Pope of all people waiting. Not that Russian Catholicism. It's not like there's a big link there, but whatever. But he's been known to do this,
Base.
and there's also reports the fact that during these meetings, Putin has also told Netanyahu that we will use our S-400s in that country. We'll use our jets in this country to defend Syrian airspace against any foreign strikes, including Israeli. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And I see, especially on the foreign policy side, Gantz having less, I guess, call it resolve aggression than Netanyahu, being as he's more of a move toward the center. But that's just all speculation. Time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, with Putin threatening to shoot down the Israeli the planes, that has a lot to do with the summit that happened. And what was happening
Mm-hmm.
was the Syrian summit occurred between the leaders of Turkey, Russia, Iran, and Syria. And part of the purpose of that summit was to create the formation of the new Syrian government and their constitution, just start having these steps towards the political solution and end of the conflict. And part of the summit was positive in the sense that they have honed down Western Syria as pretty much the only main um, area of terrorists being the pocket of Idlib. Other than that, the eastern portion of Syria is fine only because the U.S. and Kurds occupied. There's no real like physical threat, so to speak, from there.
Yeah, the Kurds can be
Um,
negotiated with, despite what else you can say about them.
and it's possible that the U.S. may be withdrawing soon. Just looking at the reality of the situation, I think they're banking more on that. But the purpose of the summit ultimately in the end is to just start having a future where the world just accepts the reality of Assad. And so of course, when this summit is supposed to take place is when Israel is trying to bomb Syria. And so this is when the threats of the shooting down occurs. And so long term, I think Russia is going to be playing a pivotal role. Uh, if Netanyahu is voted out, because the thing is Netanyahu had a sort of weird hold over Putin. Uh, he was able to get some of his way. He did get a green light from Putin to bomb Syria as long as it was Iranian targets. So there was something going on between Russia and Israel to a certain extent that disallowed all out enmity. If you recall, Netanyahu was trying to form a new world coalition between like the US, Trump and Putin and them, and the enemies being Assad, Iran, obviously all of Israel's enemies,
Well,
which, which are right now Putin's allies. And so I think Putin might be freed up a little bit if this Gantz guy is coming in. Because the thing is that with the liberals, it is true that both political parties in Israel want to wipe out the Palestinians internally, but as to how they handle the other nations outside of Israel, they're not actually in lock and step in line. I mean, the liberals are going to be more okay with being a small country. It is people like Likud, the party of Likud, who want greater Israel, you know, and that's Netanyahu's party. So I think this might help Putin in the long run in dealing with Israel and Syria at the same time. But in the end, with the summit, I mean, Putin is he is the grand winner of the Syrian conflict. In
n-
the end, I mean, Assad did win, but at a great cost. I mean, even Iran did win, got a lot of training or what have you, but it's still at the cost of some soldiers. So I mean, in the end, Putin is going to be in the driving seat of the new government in Damascus. So, uh, this bodes well for them. It's not the same. It's not the same relationship that America was hoping to have with, say, Iraq or Afghanistan after invading it. They took a sort of the approach of conqueror, where they sort of installed their new and own government with favorable people. They had to remove Saddam, for instance. Whereas in this situation, it was totally different, where Russia came in and helped the existing government maintain its course. And so, in this regard, Russia has won so much credibility, where the U.S. loses credibility in a similar intervention. And
Right. And
oh, go.
ultimately it's about support. Iraqis didn't want to be invaded overall, didn't want to be invaded by the US, and it was one of the most hubristic and farcical episodes like in Western history, where they tried initially to blame Iraq for 9/11, and then weapons of mass destruction and so on and so on. And so there was no credibility, even though they had Kurds and Shia initially on their side. That quickly turned, and even the kind of civil war that was taking place in Iraq after the invasion was something that America simply couldn't manage. And I think the only reason I think Putin has pulled this off is he chose the winning side. Whereas I think with America, it decided it was the winning side, that it was the main catalyst, and it would determine from sheer willpower what kind of future there would be. So it's interesting to me that um, you know uh, that Putin, a lot of things have just aligned for him and for Russia. On the one hand, Syria is very important for Russia with the warm sea port, in the Mediterranean. So this is very important territory. Um, on the other hand, and as well, he chose the side that I think was going to win. So
now just to build on that, going back a little, Putin's, I would say, permissiveness towards the Israelis, especially around this time last year, allowing them to strike Iranian targets, really forgiving the spy plane shoot down incident. I would say it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily like any sway over him. I'd say Putin was just playing his hands realistically. Not that any sway didn't exist, but he just looked at the deck he had and decided, okay, it's untenable to do this, this, and this, so I just have to wait it out for the time being. And I guess he waited it out. Number two, the summit, just with Putin, Rouhani, and Erdogan all there together. Anyone looking at that, like, try telling this to somebody in the
Hmm.
'90s, where it's like, oh, liberal democracy will prevail worldwide, and then some of the three major rising powers of this century are sitting there, and all led by very strongman type leaders. It just I find it a bit humorous. And number three, the other point I was going to make is, as you were describing, the U.S. decided it was going to be the winning side. They were going to reshape the region, while Russia actually decided to play into the politics of the region. Said, okay, Assad, we've had a relationship with the Syrian government for a long time. We're going to back them to the degree we can without going to outright war with either Turkey or Israel, or even going on a full counterinsurgency war like the American disaster in Iraq. So in many ways, you could argue that America's failures in Iraq actually provided Russia some case studies on what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
I mean, its own failure in Afghanistan, even. I mean, this was the problem with imperialism. It was that they were trying to do a top-down imposition, and it never worked in the Middle East. And right now, Russia has sort of learned a new method, a new way, and it is severely affecting Trump and the U.S.'s ability to be able to manage the Middle East. I mean, as we had Ryan Dawson on last week, I mean, we discussed the reality of whether Israel will, um, what its situation is, and Ryan's ultimate conclusion was that it is very possible, it's very likely that within our lifetime we will see Israel in an extremely limited state, and so. And it's like every weekend something new has been happening. Every weekend, every week, and I think this sort of buildup is a reflection of what is happening in history in the grander scheme of things.
Now, I do also want to expand on that, not to go on too long, but I think where Israel really went wrong, now you could point to several other things, but I think in recent history is the 2018 Syrian standoff, where we spent about a week him hawing before he dropped some cruise missiles on some Syrian targets. I think Israel really was banking on the fact that the U.S. is going to go outright regime change. Assad will be dead, and the country will be in chaos, and will be several factions fighting even more intensely than they do. No central government. They were expecting a Libya-style situation to happen in Syria in
Yeah.
2018. They banked on that. It didn't pay off. It didn't happen. Okay, actually, the exact opposite happened, where Assad actually solidifies a lot of power with the help from the Russians, with the help from Iran. Really takes out these last rebel strongholds, such as the ones in Daraa, southern Syria, pushes on Idlib, starts preliminary talks with Kurdish forces, and less U.S. even on a political level interest in Syria, with Trump saying several times, "Let's get out," or "Let's reduce our numbers," or just in general less U.S. Western commitment to Syria. So not only did it not pan out for Israel, it played out in the exact opposite direction than they were expecting. And look, I'm not saying it would have been good for them either way, even they banked on, oh, things aren't going to go our way in Syria, but I'm saying they'd be in a lot better position today if they would have had a little bit of foresight.
Right, right. And so instead, they thought they could just like the will itself was enough. And in a way, it's kind of surprising because um, you could argue that they could have learned from Vietnam, although Vietnam culturally is well within the Western sphere now. But that's not the case for Iraq. Iraq isn't. Iraq is in itself like a no man's land, divided into several different sectors, with other polities outside it, determining a lot of what happens or doesn't happen. Um, yeah. The other thing I think about is what does what's the state of Sunni Islam at this moment now? Because you have huge portions of Sunni Muslims that have, as refugees and as just economic migrants, have moved into Europe, And let's not forget that tens of like no one knows for sure how many thousands of Sunni Muslims, flocked to Syria for this war. And even now, there is a refugee camp uh, within the Kurdish-held region of eastern Syria that is, over 50,000 Sunni Muslims, and women there are enforcing Sharia law. Uh, Al Baghdadi, in fact, made some statements this week about creating a new insurgency and so on and so on. But I guess what I'm getting at is it seems like every opportunity they've had by sort of working against the U.S., this kind of strange duplicitous relationship that America's had with Sunni Islam going at least as far back with Bin Laden in Afghanistan, where they're frenemies and they literally will work together and then attack each other. The other half of this equation in the Middle East is also, what about Sunni Islam, right? Because Saudi Arabia is appearing very weak right now, and even though Shia Muslims are outnumbered 10-1, their projection of power, their ability to punch above their weight, is so obvious right now.
And
So
I do want to expand on that with the, I guess you could say, spiritual and civilization state of Sunni Islam. And you look at it after World War One, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, this quite literally self-declared caliphate that represented Islam. I mean, the fact that Muslims actually got the star and crest symbol from the Turkish flag, not instead the other way around. They represented that for a good
mm-hmm.
700 years. After the collapse, that you have Ataturk, the secular nationalism of Turkey, but then Erdogan comes along, starts going the more like we're a traditionalist Muslim country. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states start to falter. And I would say what you said was true, but I also say that like the being able to punch above their weight and the power projection of Sunni Islam is shifting back to Turkey.
Right, I do think so, but I don't think it's impressive. And
Yeah,
and and
I would agree, but I still think it's just an interesting development to watch in real time.
I agree with you. It is going back there. There is but I guess what I'm trying to get at, there's a vacuum everywhere else,
Yeah, I mean, and
and
even just to play on
within the
your
Middle East.
go ahead.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to say there's the depletion of power of Sunni power within North Africa in the Middle East, and yeah, I was just mainly pointing out how how strong the Shia form of Islam is right now. So in a sense, I guess all I'm just to finalize is this strange relationship that America's had with Sunni Islam. It has affected Sunni Islam as well in a very negative way over the past 40 years or so.
uh, uh,
Yeah, I mean, most of like this like in the West, you see everything gets kind of like gayed, everything kind of gets multicultural, and where you see that happening in Islam or amongst Muslims in the West, it is still even then amongst this sort of Arab, North African um, Sunni population who have sort of adopted the sort of hip hop gangster culture that they're sort of selling to these kids in London and Berlin or what have
Paris,
you. Yeah,
yeah.
they're selling. It's not really the Islam of their parents, where they're straight edge, not
Hmm.
drinking and praying every day. It's the westernized Islam where you don't have to believe or pray. You can listen to rap music or whatever. And this is being sold by elites to them.
women in rainbow
Let's not.
hijabs
Yeah, this is.
I'm a lesbian, a feminist, and a Muslim.
and white men are
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like the archetype of every Muslim you see from Toronto, pretty much. That's your average Western Muslim,
Right.
or the people like these talking heads of like the Pakistani Muslims that get on the BBC. Even someone who's a bit more moderate, like the Majid Nawaz type, who's like paints himself as an anti-extremist. He's just a Western liberal who so happens to marginally believe in Islam, but that's aside the point.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean that's all I got. I mean, I know that you have more to cover, but I need to bounce. I need to deal with some marriage responsibilities. But
is that
GSP,
number one,
thank you
two,
for
three, or
coming
four?
back.
Whoa.
Obligatory joke, I
uh,
know.
no, it's all good.
Ah, Constantine.
But anyway, GSV, thanks for coming back.
Thank
It
you.
was
Glad
hard
to be back,
booking
guys.
people without you. It's a lot easier just having you.
Appreciate it. I'm glad to be back.
All right, for sure. All right, I'll talk to you guys later, and thank you again to the audience.
Take care.
Now, just to close this out for the past 10 minutes or so, Hungary, as you put it, your words, not mine, has officially returned to the Eastern Bloc, with the U.S. reviving Radio Free Hungary. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, during the Cold War, we had several radio stations set up for each country. Even like Radio Free Europe, I'm sure you see people link to their articles all the time, set up as like sort of a counter to the Soviet media overtaking the Eastern European countries, sort of like the American voice behind the Iron Curtain. Of course, I don't remember what the equivalent is called, but I mean all the very pro-communist media outlets and pro-communist organizations in like Western Europe, especially West Germany, and even to an extent Italy, strangely enough. But the U.S. has revived that, quoting that Hungary has returned to autocracy, authoritarianism, and has abandoned liberal democracy. Which is funny because I don't think Orban would dispute. I think the only one who would dispute is probably autocracy. He's like, yeah, we're an authoritarian liberal democracy. So what? I mean, of course, Hungary has bore the brunt of the populist revolution, if you will. They were the trailblazers in this in the post Cold War era. They've been the most openly pro Russia with Orban, and I would say they've been the most openly anti US. I mean, not necessarily with Donald Trump. I mean, under Obama, under Bush, of course, because they were still part of this broad liberal internationalism. Trump, arguably yes, arguably no, but that's beside the point. But Trump's State Department, the people under Trump have been really working to undermine Orban for the past two election cycles. In the past, any political event, it's either Soros or the State Department or the UK sponsoring some demonstration against Orban. So Hungary's officially returned to the Eastern Bloc, and I have a feeling they won't be the first country to officially fall under the dark shroud of authoritarianism. But it is an interesting shift. Now, of course, I don't see Hungary leaving the EU or NATO anytime soon. Again, you don't necessarily leave those things, but I see them being iced out in the same sense of how U.S. Turkish relations have become strained.
Yeah, I would agree. And just this week, Judith Varga, the minister, one of the ministers for Hungary, visited Brussels um, for the EU affairs meeting, and she tweeted out that Hungary was being put on pillory for rejecting mass migration, to which Sophie Veld of the Democrat 66 party from the Dutch representative said, you're not being put in a pillory for rejecting immigration, but for violating human rights, destroying the rule of law, and non-compliance with EU law. Don't play the martyr.
All the liberal buzzwords. Well, we don't like your country, so here's what you're in violation of. These are completely arbitrary. We'll apply them however they want. We don't care if you're Hungary. We don't care if you're North Korea. You are morally
Yeah.
the same in our eyes. But beyond that,
Should Varga proposition her and say, you know what? We'll allow the Soros University to operate again in Hungary, as long as you agree to no more mass immigration and migration. But as if Brussels is going to say, yeah, it's a deal. Like,
yeah.
it's so transparent. But yeah, they this is a clear sign that that Hungary, in a sense, is 1 foot outside of the EU.
Now, I will go this far in terms of all the Western liberal buzzword accusations from Washington, from Brussels. And you see actually Putin moving towards this. Whenever any Western liberal country says that, any pro-Russia or anti-liberal country should just say back is like, well, the West is just gay at this point. I mean, Putin has pretty much outright said that. Not so much Orban, but I think it's the best response you can do. It's like, you have child drag shows. Why do we care what you say?
I know. Literally, they should have just stuck to exporting democracy instead of
Yeah.
drag hour readings for children.
And
Yeah, it's not impressive, and I mean, of course, the I think long term, let's say 50 years from now, I think what the EU is deathly afraid of is they know that the demographic shift is only happening in Western Europe,
yeah, and
and that's going to
arguable at that, I would say northwestern Europe because I mean, look,
yeah.
they go through Italy, they go through Spain, they don't stay there though. They're just, oh, we need to walk through here to get to all of the welfare benefits. But one thing I'll also say is I am remiss that countries like Russia, countries like Iran, countries like China are not making propaganda reels right now of pride parades and all this other degeneracy going on in Western liberal cities. It's the ultimate win. It's like these are the people who want to liberate you. Do you want their liberation?
Yeah, yeah. Um, and you see the West clinging even more tightly to this. Like literally, the rainbow flag now represents the West. Just like the BBC prom night concert that we saw on the weekend. But they hold on to it and wave it ever more fervently. It has really become the sign of the West. Uh, Nothing typifies liberal democracy better than than the gay flag. So in my travels through Eastern Europe, this is like to them this is laughable. They don't take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
you had the Catholic Orthodox of Eastern Europe. Now, as much as they may have their own struggles, they at least recognize them as problems, work towards those, and still uphold their beliefs. You have the traditionalist Muslims of the Middle East, and you have the red communists of China, all agreeing on one thing: is that this is unacceptable.
yeah, yeah. Um, no society can go on like this indefinitely. The kind of technologies that I mean, what are you going to do? What's the next level? Droids? Like people aren't reproducing. You have um, you're pushing constantly pushing sexual degeneracy.
I mean, what are we gonna
Where does
start
it
doing?
go?
Like just like farming people, like like grow them like crops. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if
Uh,
these soulless miscreants in charge of the Western world decide to do that. But again, that's beside the point. Now, continuing on Orban, he also has plans to go and speak at a nationalist protest in Italy. Now, the Italian people are feeling the effects of their new coalition government with the Five Star and Democratic Party coalition. And they've become very unpopular. Over the past week, there were demonstrations. The Brothers of Italy have really stepped up on this. Of course, that's Maloney's party, and then you have, of course, the League. And even a lot of disaffected Five Star voters, like more of the right wing of the party, are like, no, this is unacceptable. We're not standing for this. But you have Orban, who has pretty much recently been blacklisted by the United States, going to Italy to support what they'll probably try to term as regime change. There, it's like, oh, Orban's trying to overthrow the democratically elected Italian government. I can almost guarantee you, at least the BBC will run a headline exactly like that, or almost indistinguishable from that. I can almost guarantee you that some Western media outlet will say, oh, Orban's trying to start an illiberal revolution by supporting fellow neo-fascist Matteo Salvini in Italy. I'm calling it right now. Next 6 months,
oh
by
yeah,
2020, that article will be out.
absolutely. The Guardian, in fact, had a headline about Salvini, the fascist of Italy. He's they brought up anecdotal stories about a landlord in north northern Italy denying rent to a southern Italian, and saying they're all the same to me. They're like gypsies or Africans and so on. And so like this one example, as if no one ever did that before Salvini.
Oh yeah.
Uh, is as if Northern Italians had only discovered it now because of Salvini. Uh, that's so. They're trying to promulgate the idea that he's setting these fires ablaze, and
Now,
that people weren't already fed up. That uh, they can. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
It's fine. It's
They're
fine.
over.
But I do want to expand on what GSP was saying. Is the fact that number one, of course, they'll point to this anecdotal evidence that Salvini is rising fascism, like how they point to Trump at Charlottesville, or all these various things, and how Trump is a neo-Nazi white supremacist type thing. But number one is, Salvini is, he's actually a bit middling in some ways, the way I see it. And number two, he has historically allied himself with parties like Five Star up until recently, and like the FDI, which are popular among Southern Italians. And if you want to attack any party as a quote unquote neo-fascist movement in Italy, the FDI, the Brothers of Italy, probably proclaim themselves as I mean, at least at the beginning, they probably proclaim themselves as the successors to Mussolini's movement. So I'm not saying that's
Right,
accurate, but like
right.
you figured they
So
would be the
it's
more logical
unfounded.
target.
Yeah, the whole point is to set off a kind of panic amongst European liberals and North American liberals, right? Fascism is rising, the 30s are coming back, and so on and so on. Well, of course they're not, and although a few of those realities exist, and I don't mean the anecdotal story that I pointed out earlier, but I mean about what are Europeans supposed to do with a massive demographic shift? They literally don't have any other homes. There's no other place they can go to. So looking forward, it could be just like in Syria. Populist nationalism is just a reality you're going to have to accept, and no amount of whining and setting off panic is going to alter that, because ultimately they if they want to preserve something of what their identity has been for hundreds and thousands of years, well, I'm sorry, but they're going to they're going to do that. But to compare it to the 30s is, you know,
Yeah,
ridiculous.
throwing in an economic crash, we might get halfway there, but even still. Uh, but beyond that, speaking of
Yeah,
economic crashes, I want to go to the Brexit scenario. Now, of course, it's still a bit in limbo. Boris Johnson, is still adamant that the 31st, October 31st, will be the day the UK finally Brexits. Now, you have, of course, all the liberal, neoliberal establishment articles running headlines like, oh, here's things there'll be a shortage of. Here's things that we'll lose out when we leave the European Union, and listing like the most basic things like toilet paper. They want to make it sound like it's going to be Weimar Germany if they leave the European Union. Now, look, once they do, it's going to be hard, especially with the No Deal. But they're going to very quickly find themselves in the American sphere. We've seen the preliminary moves towards this, but uh, so far, there's been no major development except the fact that Parliament's in a bit of a weird situation. People pushing for an election, whatever. The supposed temporary suspension of Parliament, trying to invoke the royal family to use their power in order to favor. Again, it's all very muddy situation. It's been like this since June of 2016, but it is funny to watch the liberals try to run damage control. That beware, the sky is falling. It's the end of the world. You better stock up on toilet paper because we're not going to be able to get any if we step outside of the European Union. Because, as we all know, every country outside the European Union is in abject poverty.
right. And uh, the, I think to see it on a larger symbolic level, I think Brexit represents, besides the practical concerns, besides say the Northern Ireland border and so on, um, I think to see a symbolic kind of death of the post World War II liberal order.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Uh,
how can one of the original bastions of liberalism ever abandon this wonderful project?
right, and um, so I think that's where the hysteria is. Ultimately, uh, most Remainers, even if the economy took a nosedive, but it meant staying in the European Union, would be happy with that. Primarily because they wouldn't be affected.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, it's all the um, as they're called in Europe, the middle class, or as we'd call them in more the North American context, the upper middle class. It's
Right.
those types. It's the type that work in the banking sector or have these cushy office jobs, or these people who really, no matter how the economy goes, aren't going to struggle, have investment funds, retirement funds, all these things. I wouldn't go as far as to say offshore accounts, but the thing is, they're living on easy street. They still have to work for a living, but not as hard as the rest of us.
Right. And so, there are movie stars and there are other celebs who will, of course, um, get ever more vociferous as October approaches. I wouldn't doubt it if we see um, violent protests and the media siding, with the Remainers. Uh, I even foresee a possibility of a Hong Kong kind of thing going on.
Yeah, I could
Develop.
definitely see this actually rising to the level of street violence between two factions, which is, I mean, look, I would expect out of continental European countries, especially in Eastern or Southern Europe. I mean, we had it on a weekly basis in Greece about 4 years ago, but it actually is a bit odd to think about that actually happening in London. But just going back to the very affluent liberal takes, or of course, we all know that the awful is the AW FL is the affluent white female liberals, if you will. But that's aside the point. That's a credit to, of course, the wonderful user of Twitter, Scott Greer. One of the few good blue check marks, mind you. They were talking about how, oh, it's great we can go on these skiing trips in Sweden and Finland. How will we ever survive? It's like that's the Northwestern European attitude. But then you talk to someone who lives in Spain, in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland. Not so much Poland, but in like some of these other countries like Slovenia or Croatia. It's like our countries are being absolutely pillaged. Romania is another big one that actually gets caught in that. We're losing our workforce.
Mhm.
We're losing our young people to Western Europe, but at least some upper middle class people from London and Birmingham, at least they can go on their ski trips.
Yeah, there isn't going to be that much empathy, and especially with the working class in Britain as well. Um, Plus, they're also concerned about. I mean, I don't know how much Britain's policy towards migration is going to change with Brexit. Um, Maybe the overall tenor, the overall message, the unspoken message well, yeah, the implied message of Brexit will fuel the possibility of mitigating the amount of uh, migrants that come in there. Because of course, a Britain that's not part of the EU, um, for many economic migrants, may prove to be in its own, its own sort of retarder for the kind of scale of migration that we're seeing take place. So
Yeah, granted, I think any migration that they offset by leaving the union, though, I mean, even the conservative, more like even Farage of all people outright said like, let's get immigration from our former Asian and African colonies because let's work with the Commonwealth states. Let's bring in over a bunch of people from India and Pakistan. So again, it's sort of a lose lose situation unless they find somebody truly competent. But unless you have anything else to say on that, I'm gonna close out the show.
no, I'm good, thanks.
Now, I just want to request chat. Since this will be premiered, of course, you'll be hearing this about 5, 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. If you're still with us, I want you to press S for BB because our good friend Benjamin Netanyahu will return to the opposition. So, press S for BB. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's good to have GSP back.
Right.
Thank you to both, again, to Fasci
Thank you.
Zizek and Ryan Dawson for
Grazie.
coming on the show. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We will see you
Thanks,
guys next
guys.
week, and goodbye.